Hello and welcome to Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 24, the Awareness Quotient Levels Explained, which I'm surprised it's taken 24 podcasts to get to this point, but here we go. Please forgive any noises in the background. My parrot is in the summer house with me. So today we begin a new season, and this season is about the practical architecture of constructed development theory, the tools, the models, the assessments, the experiments, and the things we can actually use to examine how a person is constructing self, context, choice, and response. And the obvious place to begin is with the awareness quotient, or as I call it, AQ. Now, the model people usually encounter first is the AQ, and also the model most likely to be misunderstood, because the moment you introduce levels, human beings do something extremely predictable. They turn them into rankings. Higher means better, lower means worse. So high AQ means intelligent, low AQ means stupid. High AQ means ethical, low AQ means potentially dangerous, and then high AQ means evolved, and low AQ means inferior. Then people immediately begin wondering what score they are, what score their partner is, whether their manager is secretly AQ4, and whether somebody they dislike can be developmentally diagnosed from a mildly irritating email. And that is not what AQ is for, really. The awareness quotient is not a measure of human value. It's not a quick list. It's not intelligence, personality, morality, education, status, seniority, or it's not even a badge. And it's not a permanent statement about the whole person. AQ concerns a more precise question. How much of the construction of self, context, choice, and response is currently available to awareness? That is the central definition. What can the person see? What remains invisible? What are they subject to? What do they take as object? What parts of the construction feel like reality itself? What parts can be examined, compared, revised, and deliberately used? AQ describes the territory available to awareness. And the levels from AQ4 to AQ10 describe increasingly complex relationships with authority, self, culture, maps, territory, and construction itself. But before we move through them, we need to establish an important principle. You do not simply have one AQ in every moment. A person may demonstrate considerable awareness in one context and very little in another. They may think developmentally at work and become completely automatic in an intimate relationship. They may understand systems and remain unaware of status, and they might recognize cultural influence and remain fused with professional identity. They may even describe CDT brilliantly and still react defensively when challenged. So awareness is dynamic and it's contextual. It might even be pressure sensitive, identity sensitive. But obviously the highest levels of the AQ, identity, personality, things like that, are a choice. Development may create a more stable centre of gravity, but the current construction still matters. So when I say that this person is operating at AQ6, I don't mean that this entire human being permanently belongs in the AQ6 box. I mean that the construction available in this context shows features associated with AQ6, patterns, cognitive intentions, constructions, combinations, that kind of thing. That distinction keeps the model developmental rather than diagnostic. And another point also matters. AQ4 is not the lowest imaginable level of human awareness. It is the lowest level the model currently attempts to measure meaningfully. I mean, it could even go lower, I don't know. But the scale begins where the relevant patterns become sufficiently visible for assessment. So AQ4 doesn't mean barely conscious. It describes a particular relationship with authority, rules, identity, and reality. So let us begin there. AQ4, and I've called it authority aware, but remember please that the labels are relatively meaningless. At AQ4, reality is largely organised externally. Authority defines what is true, rules define what is correct, roles define who people are, and the person may be highly competent, knowledgeable, and effective within a structured environment, and they may know exactly what to do and follow processes, even apply standards, respect hierarchy, and meet expectations. And this can be extremely useful. Many systems depend on consistency, duty, and following rules. An emergency service cannot function if every instruction becomes a philosophical debate. A prison, a hospital, military unit, school, or business needs people who can work inside agreed structures. AQ4 is not incompetence. The developmental limitations appear when the authority, role, or rule cannot easily become an object of awareness. The rule is not experienced as one possible construction. It is simply how things are. The authority knows the system has decided, the role determines the response. A person operating from AQ4 might say, well, this is the policy, and this is what management wants, and this is how we do it. That's one of my pet peeves is, but we've always done it this way. And those are the rules, or I was only following instructions. The external structure reduces ambiguity. It also reduces the need for independent construction. Good and bad may be defined through obedience. Correctness may depend upon alignment with authority, and challenge can then feel like a disorder, or uncertainty can feel unsafe. The person may interpret disagreement as disrespect rather than information. And this is why AQ4 is called authority aware. Authority is visible and significant, but the construction of authority itself might not be. The person sees who has authority. They may not yet examine how legitimacy is created, what assumptions the authority carries, or when responsibility requires disobedience. The AQ4 strength is reliability within structure. The AQ4 risk is outsourcing judgment. We talked about that in a previous episode where you've got the external consultant. And development does not mean learning to reject all authority. That would simply reverse the dependency. It means becoming capable of examining authority before deciding how to respond. AQ5, I call this discovering self. At AQ5, the individual self begins to emerge more clearly from external authority. The person begins asking, well, what do I think and what do I want? And what works for me? What are my goals? What makes me different? And this can feel liberating. The person becomes more internally referenced, and they may challenge inherited expectations, perhaps seek independence or develop ambition, construct a personal identity. They become less willing to accept rules merely because somebody else wrote them. AQ5 is strongly associated with the discovery of agency. The person begins becoming the author of their own story, but authorship is still relatively centered upon the self. The world may be constructed through personal need, preference, success, identity, and individual aspiration. Other people can become part of the person's project. They might be helpful or obstructive or difficult or relevant. And the person might say, well, this is who I am. This is what I want. I need to be true to myself. I have to do what's right for me. Again, none of those statements is inherently wrong. AQ5 performs important developmental work. A person cannot become more aware of self without first developing a self distinct enough to observe. So the danger is that the newly discovered self may be treated as an essence. Personality becomes fixed. Preference becomes truth. Authenticity becomes the demand that the environment accommodate the present construction. And the person might escape external authority but become governed by identity. I'm just not that kind of person. Well, this is not me. I know what I want. The AQ5 strength is agency and self-definition. The AQ5 risk is mistaking the current self for the final self. At AQ4, authority writes a script. At AQ5, the person begins writing their own, but they may not yet see how culture, history, relationships, and cognitive intentions have shaped the author. AQ6 now, I call this cultural aware. At AQ6, the person becomes more aware that self does not exist independently of social context. Culture becomes visible, other perspectives matter, group norms, relationships, expectations, and shared meanings enter awareness. The person may begin asking, well, how will this affect others? What is expected here? How do people like us understand this? And what does this group value? What does this context require? And this is a major developmental expansion. AQ5 discovers the individual. AQ6 discovers that the individual is embedded. Now, the person becomes more sensitive to relationships, inclusion, social position, and contextual meaning. And they might develop empathy or perspective taking, even some political awareness or cultural awareness. A stronger understanding that people construct reality differently. That starts to happen now. And this can make them more collaborative and less rigidly self-centered. But the self may now become heavily organized through belonging. Identity is no longer defined only by personal preference. It's also shaped by group membership, maybe a professional identity, community, culture, ideology, team, even family. The person may move from, I decide what's true, to a bit more of, we understand what is true. The group becomes a developmental environment. It can expand awareness and it can also become another authority. At AQ6, people may recognize that cultures differ while remaining captured by their own cultural construction. They may tolerate diversity in principle, but struggle when another perspective threatens belonging or moral identity. And they may become highly attuned to consensus, approval, fairness, social legitimacy. The AQ6 person might ask, well, what will people think? What is the accepted view? How do we bring everyone with us? And what is the culturally appropriate response? Well, these are useful questions. The limitation appears when group meaning becomes difficult to examine from outside the group. A person may recognize that other tribes exist while remaining fused with their own. And although they do see culture, they might not yet fully see that their culture as one map amongst many. And the AQ6 strength is contextual and relational awareness. AQ6 risk is captured by collective identity. At AQ4, the rule governs. At AQ5, the self governs. At AQ6, the shared world governs. AQ7 now, which I call self-aware. I did have self-awareness at AQ8, but a lot of people were profiled at AQ7 and demonstrated a lot more self-awareness than I initially thought. So it was right to drop it down to AQ7. AQ7 is where the self itself becomes increasingly available to awareness. See, told you. Not merely what do I want, but what is the self that wants this? The person begins recognizing patterns, defensive motives, contradictions, that kind of thing, and the identity beneath the response. And they may notice, I am constructing this as rejection. I need to appear competent, or I am attached to being right, or I am performing confidence. I want to say, I want honesty, but I may actually want agreement. And the self is no longer simply the source of judgment. It becomes something that can be observed. This is a significant shift in how they construct their thinking. At AQ5, the self is discovered. At AQ7, the self becomes object. And if you're familiar with Keegan, you understand the points. So the person may recognize that identity has a history, that preference is constructed, or that emotional response may be protecting something. That the story they tell about themselves is selective and constructed, and they can begin distinguishing intention from explanation, and this creates deeper choice. So the person does not have to reject the self, they can examine it. AQ7 often brings increased introspection, but introspection alone is not enough. A person can think about themselves constantly while remaining fused with the thinker. And they may analyze every feeling and still treat their interpretation as reality. AQ7 requires more than self-focus. It involves awareness of the construction of self. The strength is reflexivity. The risk is sophisticated self-absorption, and a person may become so interested in their internal world that context systems and territory receive insufficient attention. They may explain themselves brilliantly without changing response. They may become the expert narrator of their own repetition. I know why I do this, they might say, which is fine. Did the awareness create another choice? That's the question. That's the test. AQ7 can also become an identity. I am highly self-aware. A dangerous sentence, really, because the self-claiming awareness may be protecting itself through the claim. And the developmental edge appears when the observer also becomes the observable. So AQ8, I call this map aware. For those of you who know, map and territory were by a guy called Korzybski, and I've directly used the labels here. So AQ8, map aware. At this level, models, beliefs, identities, and interpretations become visible as maps. The person recognizes that this is one way of constructing the situation. It's not necessarily that this is the situation itself. This creates cognitive flexibility when you realize this. The person can compare frameworks, move between perspectives, or recognize that different models illuminate different features. They may use personality theory, systems thinking, developmental theory, economics, psychology, or strategy without requiring one model to become the whole truth. AQ8 can hold contradictions more comfortably. So, for example, a person might say, from this perspective, the behavior looks defensive. And from a systems perspective, the environment is producing it. And from the person's position, the response may be entirely rational. The map-aware person can change lenses. This is why I've said that an AQ8 person could deliberately adopt different personality styles. There are videos on YouTube about this. They are less fused with one fixed identity. They can construct for context, and that is dynamic intelligence. It doesn't mean that they become endlessly adaptable or fake. It means they understand that behavior, identity, and models can be used rather than merely inhabited. The AQ8 strength is meta-model awareness. The risk is becoming enamored with maps. A person may collect frameworks, explain everything through elegant abstraction, or move so quickly among interpretations that they avoid commitment, or believe that recognizing multiple maps means every map is equally adequate. They're not. Some maps contain more territory, some distort, some predict badly, and some create harm. Now, map awareness does not remove the need for judgment, it improves the basis on which judgment can be constructed. So another AQ8 risk is detachment. The person sees the role as a role, the identity as an identity, and the model as a model, and may begin standing outside of that participation. But development is not permanent observation, it's participation with awareness. AQ8 can recognize the stage. It must still decide how to act within the play. We move on to AQ9 now, which I've called territory aware, which is the next level up for Korzybski. AQ9 represents a movement beyond map comparison toward greater availability of territory. And it doesn't mean that direct access to reality as it truly is. No human being escapes perception, language, and construction. Territory aware means the person can tolerate and integrate more complexity before collapsing into a preferred map. More dots become available, more relationships, more levels of consequence, more perspectives, and more temporal depth. The person may notice not only the immediate issue, but the systems, history, environment, power, identity, and future possibilities involved. AQ8 recognizes my map is not the territory. AQ9 asks, what territory remains unavailable because of the maps currently organizing my attention and intention? And this is a more demanding position. The person does not merely switch models, they expand what can be contained, and they can hold uncertainty, contradiction, emergence, multiple interacting systems. And they may recognize that the apparent problem changes depending on scale. A performance issue may also be a leadership issue, a systems issue, developmental issue, a cultural issue, historical, and finally a power issue. AQ9 does not simply make the problem more complicated for pleasure. The aim is adequacy, to construct a response capable of accounting for more of what is actually operating. The AQ9 strength is territorial tolerance. The risk is complexity without movement, and the person may see so much that the response becomes difficult. Every action has consequences. Every frame excludes something. Every solution creates another problem. High awareness can become paralysis if choice is never constructed. The AQ9 challenge is to act while retaining complexity, not wait for complete knowledge, not reduce the territory too early, construct a response adequately enough for the current moment while remaining open to revision. That is dynamic intelligence at greater scale. AQ9 also recognizes that environments determine availability. A lower AQ person inside a more complex developmental environment may access dots they could not produce alone. And this is where the more complex other and the zone of dynamic development become central. Development is not merely inside the person. The territory made available by the environment changes what the person can construct. And now we're on AQ10, which is construction aware. Now it's going to be the most easily misunderstood level. I've never met anybody at this level, and I don't think there are any people at this level. But when you hear AQ10 and imagine the finished human, the apex, the enlightened master, the person who sees everything, that is precisely what AQ10 cannot be. If AQ10 became a fixed identity, it would contradict itself. AQ10 describes recursive awareness of construction, not merely awareness of self or awareness of maps or then awareness of territory at AQ9, awareness of how mapper, map, territory, identity context, and observation are being constructed in relation to one another. The observer becomes observable, the model becomes visible as a model, and the developmental level becomes visible as a developmental construction. Even constructed development theory becomes available as construction. AQ10 can say, this model helps organize what I am seeing. And also, this model is shaping what I'm able to see. And this is a profound recursive move. The person can notice not only that they are defending an identity, but that they are constructing an observer who claims to be separate from the identity being defended. And they may notice that the claim to have transcended ego is another ego construction. It's one of the things that frustrates me about the other developmental systems that are out there. That the claim to possess no fixed self has become a fixed identity. I've even created a superhero called Anatman about it. That the idea of higher awareness can become status. AQ10 recursively dissolves a certainty of arrival. It cannot be possessed without being reduced. The AQ10 strength is constructional awareness. The risk is infinite recursion. If every observation becomes another construction to observe, action can disappear into philosophical loops. AQ10 still requires choice and response. The person must eventually participate. The developmental achievement is not leaving construction. There is nowhere outside construction for a human mind to stand. It is constructing deliberately while remaining aware that the construction is provisional, contextual, and consequential. And this is why AQ10 is not omniscience. It does not see everything. It knows that seeing is constructed. It does not produce perfect ethics. It creates a greater responsibility for examining what the construction makes possible. It does not become free from identity. It can use identity without believing identity is final. And it doesn't transcend maps. It recognizes mapping as an unavoidable feature of human awareness. And it doesn't reach the territory directly. It becomes increasingly aware of the relationship through which territory becomes available. And it does not become a superior person, because superiority itself would become visible as a construction. So the developmental movement. So let's place the whole sequence together. AQ4, authority defines reality. AQ5, I begin defining myself. AQ6, I recognize that self and reality are culturally and relationally embedded. AQ7, the self-constructing reality becomes visible. AQ8, my models and identities become visible as maps. AQ9, more of the territory becomes available beyond the current maps. And then finally AQ10, the construction of self-mapped territory and observer becomes recursively visible. And that is the movement. Authority, self, culture, self-awareness, map awareness, territory awareness, construction awareness. But this is not a staircase people can climb once. It's dynamic. A person may move differently in between contexts. They may contract under threat, and they may expand through dialogue, access higher complexity with a more complex other, lose it inside an environment that punishes awareness. And the AQ model describes availability, not permanent possession. And that is why the colours associated with the levels should not become personality colours. AQ4 is yellow, orange, red, reddy orange, purple, blue. AQ9 is like a teal green, and then AQ10 is green. The colours help visualise progression. They do not divide humanity into coloured species. Nor should AQ become a new hierarchy of contempt. A higher level can understand more complexity, and that doesn't guarantee good intentions. An AQ8 manipulator may be more dangerous than an AQ4 rule follower. They can see more maps, adopt more perspectives, influence more effectively. Awareness increases capacity, ethics concerns what the capacity is used to construct. And this is why high AQ does not mean a good person, nor does low AQ mean a bad person. But in my mind, a high AQ could mean someone is capable of choosing to be good or bad in the moment because they're constructing. As we said in AQ10 a minute ago, no one is either good nor bad. You're constructing it. At AQ8, they recognize they're constructing it. And a person at AQ4 may behave with loyalty, kindness, and courage. And the person at AQ9 may rationalize exploitation with extraordinary sophistication. Developmental capacity and moral intention are related but not identical. Another misunderstanding is that AQ measures intelligence. It does not. It's not an IQ test. A person can possess high academic intelligence while remaining fused with identity, authority, or ideology. Now, I've seen this a lot in universities. You're surrounded by people with PhDs who might be perfect in their field, very, very narrow PhD field. However, they are very low on the AQ scale. They don't see complexity at all. I met that all the time. So lecturers might use intelligence to defend a low awareness construction more effectively. Equally, someone without advanced education may show substantial awareness of self, context, and consequence. Knowledge can support awareness. It does not guarantee it. The difference is visible in the quality of relationships with knowing. So, can the person examine the assumptions beneath the conclusion? Can they tolerate evidence that threatens identity? Can they see the map? And can they recognize what remains unavailable? That is AQ. And AQ is not TQ. This distinction will be the subject of the next episode, but we should introduce it here just to be safe. AQ concerns availability of awareness. What dots am I joining? How aware am I? Intention, awareness, choice, response. TQ concerns the complexity with which a person constructs and responds to a particular problem. A person may possess a relatively high AQ center of gravity and still construct a specific scenario at a lower TQ under pressure. Or they may demonstrate high complexity response in one domain because of expertise, without the same awareness appearing elsewhere. So AQ asks, how much of construction is available? TQ asks, how complex is this construction? It's related but not identical. But in my PhD, TQ is specifically linked to Keegan's system. So when I say TQ2, I literally mean Keegan's stage 2. So TQ3 would be socialized mind. And AQ is not cognitive intention. Cognitive intentions shape the direction of attention. So AQ concerns whether those patterns themselves become visible. A person may be strongly procedures oriented. At lower awareness, procedure appears to be the obvious truth. At higher awareness, the person can recognize the pattern and choose options when required. That's dynamic intelligence. The cognitive intention remains. Its relationship with awareness changes, and that's why CDT is not a typing system. It's not types, not archetypes. The aim is not to identify what kind of person you are. It is to increase the range of construction available to you. The deepest practical question is therefore not, what AQ am I, or which level am I? It is, what is unavailable to awareness in this moment? What am I subject to? And that could be anything from identity, authority to an emotion. The need to appear intelligent even. The last one is key, and it's the need to be the most developed person in the room. The AQ model can become developmental vanity. People may use it to position themselves above others. Well, I can see they're only AQ 5. Maybe. Or perhaps you are constructing them reductively in order to protect your own identity as the advanced observer. And the more awareness you claim, the more recursive responsibility you carry. Can you see what your diagnosis is doing? What it makes unavailable? How it changes the relationship? Whether the model is helping development or merely organizing status? A developmentally responsible use of AQ does not reduce a person to a level. It asks what conditions might make more awareness available. What question can they engage with? What contradiction can they tolerate? What perspective lies one step beyond the current construction? What developmental environment would help? And that is the more complex other role. We talked about it in coaching too. Not dragging someone toward the highest level, but creating a perturbation just beyond their present map, a little disruption or disequilibrium, as Piaget would say. At AQ 4, the useful question may concern the purpose of the role. At AQ 5, the effect of the self's goal upon others. AQ 6, the assumptions of the group. AQ 7, the identity beneath the response. AQ 8, the limitations of the model. And then AQ 9, the unavailable territory. And finally, at AQ 10, the construction of the observer asking the question. Development is navigational. The next useful question depends upon the current position, and that is why AQ can inform coaching, education, leadership, therapy, assessment, and developmental games. It tells us not only where the person appears to be constructing from, It helps us design what might become available next. But the model must remain humble. Human beings are more complex than 7 labels. Context matters, culture, power, language. The measurement is a construction. The interpretation is a construction. You are a construction. My theory is a construction. So AQ becomes useful when it creates better questions. It becomes dangerous when it pretends to contain the person. So here is the uncomfortable question for this episode. When you think about your own awareness, what do you assume you can already see? Which authority still feels like reality? Which identity must remain true? Which cultural assumptions become invisible because everyone around you shares them? Which model have you mistaken for the territory? Which complexity do you dismiss as overthinking? And which observations are unavailable because they would threaten your position? And when you decide that somebody else is operating at a low AQ, what self are you constructing through that judgment? This is thinking deliberately. And today's uncomfortable thought is this. The awareness quotient does not measure how good, intelligent, or valuable you are. It measures what parts of your construction are available for examination before they become response. And that could mean habit. If your actions are habituated, you're not in control. At AQ4, authority is visible. At AQ5, the self emerges. At 6, culture and relationship enter. At AQ7, self becomes object. At 8, maps become maps. And at AQ9, more territory becomes available. And finally, AQ10, even the observer, the model, and the idea of development become visible as constructions. But no level gives you the final truth. No level removes consequence, and no level becomes yours permanently. Awareness is not a trophy. It is a changing relationship with what you could not previously see. The point is not to reach AQ10 and announce arrival. The point is to keep asking, what is constructing me now? What remains unavailable? And what might become possible if I could see one level more? Thank you.